גבירותיי ורבותיי, אני הבאתי משהו בעברית. אני רוצה לומר תודה רבה לדוקטור סדריק כהן סקאלי שהזמין אותי, שהוא המנהל של מכון בוצריוס, גם רוצה להודות לאמיר. זה לא רגיל שאנחנו קיבלתי הזמנה להרצות וללמד פה באוניברסיטת חיפה, ואני מאוד מכובד שהזמנתם אותי במצב חירום, במלחמה, לבוא פה, ואני גם מאוד מכובד שבאתם להרצאה שלי, משום שאני מרגיש שהמצב של הארץ פה ממש קשה. אני גם מכובד שדומיניק בורל, חברי, בא מירושלים, ואני בעצם, אני באתי ארצה פעם הראשונה בדיוק לפני 45 שנים, והתאהבתי במדינה הזו, ומיד התחלתי ללמוד עברית. ואני לא הייתי חולם שאני אחרי 45 שנה אני יושב פה ומרצה בתור פרופסור אורח באוניברסיטת חיפה. וזה במצב של מלחמה. אני מבין את הביקור שלי פה באוניברסיטת חיפה כביקור של סולידריות קריטית. סולידריות קריטית, ביקורתית, עם אוניברסיטת חיפה ועם החברים פה בזמן של מלחמה. סולידריות קריטית גם שאני לא מבין בתור סולידריות עם ממשלת ישראל ולוחמתה ברצועת עזה. אני בא, אני שומע, אני מסתכל, ואני רואה את אוניברסיטת חיפה בתור כמקום ציבורי, כמקום של דיאלוג ציבורי בארץ זו, מקום מאוד מאוד חשוב, מקום של דיאלוג אקדמי וגם פוליטי, פנים אל פנים. דיאלוג שמאוד חשוב, משום שהאוניברסיטה היא מקום של הדיאלוג הרציונלי במחקר ובמדע, גם בפוליטיקה, פנים אל פנים. לא דרך מדיה, לא דרך עיתונים, לא דרך טלוויזיה, פנים אל פנים. באוניברסיטה אנחנו לוחמים לא עם כלי נשק, אלא עם ארגומנטים, בדיאלוג. יש דיאלוג רציונלי, ובדיאלוג רציונלי אין ניצחון מוחלט, אין ניצחון סופי, או מה שאנחנו שומעים היום בפרופגנדה, יש רק החוכמה והכוח של הארגומנט הטוב יותר. לפיכך אנחנו בתור אקדמאים, אנחנו צריכים, אני חושב, לשמור על האוניברסיטה כמקום של הרציונליזם ושל הדיאלוג בין חוקרים, מלמדים, סטודנטים, דעות פוליטיות וגם בין עמים שקיימים ביחד פה בקמפוס. אני מביא מברלין אימפרטיב קטגורי, לא האימפרטיב הקטגורי של קאנט, אלא האימפרטיב הקטגורי של מנדלסון. המשפט האחרון של ספרו ירושלם, הוא כותב, liebet die Wahrheit, liebet den Frieden. באמת והשלום אהבו. זה גם האימפרטיב הקטגורי של נביא. אני מודה לכם, אני מכובד שהזמנתם אותי, תודה רבה, ואז יאללה, ההצעה. Scepticism towards progress among modern Jewish philosophers. The friendship between Moses Mendelssohn and Gotthold Ephraim Lessing was the paradigm of Jewish-Christian male friendship in German and European culture of the 18th century. Only once in his published work did Moses Mendelssohn distance himself from his friend Lessing and publicly criticized one of Lessing's writings. Mendelssohn's disagreement must therefore have been serious. It concerns Lessing's philosophy of history, which Lessing developed in his treatise Die Erziehung des Menschengeschlechts, The Education of the Human Race, published in 1780. There, Lessing had allocated three phases or epochs in the education of the human race. A childhood of the human race in which humanity is given an inner worldly moral education through reward and punishment, as revealed in the Hebrew Bible. Second, a boyhood of the human race in which humanity, through Christ as teacher and through the New Testament, is educated to believe in the immortality of the soul and in an otherworldly retribution for good and evil. And finally, third, a future manhood of educational perfection for the human race in which, guided by reason and enlightenment, man will do good because it is good. Lessing's idea of an epochal three-stage progress in the moral education of the human race, which is taken up and transformed later by, for example, Hegel, Schiller or Kleist, with Judaism as childhood, Christianity as youth, and a future manhood of enlightened reason and morality as an end in itself, is considered wrong by his friend Mendelssohn. Mendelssohn denies that there is any progress in the morality of the human race, and he also justifies his disagreement with Lessing, historically, anthropologically, and religiously. Mendelssohn objects to Lessing that the idea that the human race has developed collectively like a human individual, like a single person from child to man, is historically unsound and therefore philosophically completely wrong. Because it is evident that the human race is not an individual, but consists of a multitude of individuals who develop completely differently in different places and at different times. In this respect, comparing the education of the human race with the education of an individual is only a metaphor. But it is a deceptive metaphor that misleads, because, as Mendelssohn writes, basically in almost all centuries, if this metaphor is to apply, the human race is child and man and old man at the same time, just in different places and regions of the world. The assumption of a collective progress of the human race over thousands of years, analogous to the individual development from child to man, is therefore anthropologically and historically wrong. Historically wrong because historical experience shows differences of development past and present. Progress is reversible. Anthropologically wrong because humanity is not a collective individual, as Lessing's misleading metaphor suggests. Rather, humanity consists of individuals who go through different development processes at every point in history. Progress only occurs with individuals, and for these individuals, it turns out, very differently under different circumstances. It is precisely these differences in development that make individuals individuals. Each individual develops differently depending on time, place, and circumstances. To Mendelssohn, the talk of a progressive education of the human race therefore seems to be based on completely false philosophical premises. Progress only shows itself individually, while the human race, on the other hand, is morally stagnating. From a moral point of view, human history is a zero-sum game. Mendelssohn is skeptical about his friend Lessing's optimism on moral progress. Lessing's philosophy of history follows the pattern of a Christian theology of history that has been common since Augustine. In Augustine, the world was initially created good and completely free of defects. Evils only came into the world through Adam's fall and can only be overcome through Jesus' cross, death, resurrection, and return at the end of time. Mendelssohn rejects the salvation scheme of Christian historical theology and philosophy of history. The progress of humanity in history between the fall of man and redemption, which also resonates in a secularized manner in Lessing's education of the human race. Mendelssohn neither shares Lessing's optimism with regard to the possible future perfection of the morality of the human race, nor does he share his conviction that the particular religious ethics of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, with their specific commandments, prohibitions, virtues, and attitudes of life, can ever be replaced by general philosophical ethics, or by a comprehensive moral perfection of the human race based on the universality of reason. For Mendelssohn, unlike Lessing, the history of humanity and that of religion, and thus the history of his own religion, Judaism, is never over. Here you see the cover of Lessing's book, and you see Jerusalem, the work I quoted. And we go now to Hegel. Hegel's philosophy of history is the starting point for skepticism about progress among Jewish intellectuals in the 19th and early 20th century. For Hegel, progress is not progress in morality, as was the case with Lessing and also in Kant's philosophy of history. With Hegel, the philosophy of history becomes political, because its core is progress in the consciousness of freedom, which ends up in the modern state and in bourgeois society. But even with Hegel's idea of progress, Jews and Judaism only operate as an ancient Oriental religion at the origin of monotheism, which the world spirit, Weltgeist, has passed over since the ancient world. Rabbinic Judaism plays no role at all in Hegel's narrative of the world spirit, and for Hegel, Rabbinic Judaism has contributed nothing to humanity's progress in the consciousness of freedom. The poet Heinrich Heine is not a philosopher, but he wrote the funniest history of German intellectual life to date. The book is called Zur Geschichte der Religion und Philosophie in Deutschland, on the history of religion and philosophy in Germany, published in 1835. In that book, he presents an anecdotal and juicy intellectual history of Germany for the French audience. There is also a French version of that book. The German history of religion and philosophy, mainly from Luther to Hegel, Fichte, and Schelling, is told in highly sarcastic tones. Heine had studied in Berlin from 1821 to 1823 and attended Hegel's lectures there. His history of religion and philosophy in Germany is also still strongly influenced by Hegel's conception of philosophy. But Heine does not see the modern constitutional state and the bourgeois society as the final goal of world history, towards which the world spirit happily advances. Heine basically professes to be a revolutionary. He propagates pantheism and democracy. People are tired of Christianity's hostility to the senses, he states, in his writing, under the influence of Saint-Simon, he calls for a revolution of the senses and sexuality, not a revolution of the mind. The people should become the new gods. The people should overthrow the kings. In democracy, nectar and ambrosia, the food for the gods, should flow for everyone. I quote, "The great word of the revolution, which Saint-Just pronounced, le pain et le droit du peuple, is, with us, le pain et le droit divin de l'homme. We are fighting for the human rights of the people. We are not fighting for the human rights of the people, but for the rights of God, of the humans. We are creating a democracy of equally glorious, equally holy, equally blessed gods." This revolution should not be aimed at the progress and prosperity of the grandchildren in the future, but should enable happiness and joy in the present. Not the hope for progress in the future should mobilize the masses. Instead of longing for future satisfaction, they shall enjoy a sensual and satisfactory present. It is not, as with Hegel and Marx, work that advances world history, but rather play, art, and pleasure. The revolutionary energy should be directed towards the present, not the future. Progress is today. These are elements in the work of the poet Heine that Walter Benjamin and Hannah Arendt will refer to affirmatively in the 20th century. The opposition to Hegel's philosophy of history was completely different in the case of Nachman Krochmal. His unfinished major work, Morende Vuchei Hazman, was written in the years before his death in 1840, practically at the same time as Heine's Zur Geschichte der Religion und Philosophie in Deutschland. But Krochmal writes as an Orthodox Jew, he writes for Jewish readers in Hebrew, and he writes a completely apolitical philosophy of religion. Nonetheless, Hegel is the only Christian philosopher mentioned by name in Krochmal's work. The opposition is therefore explicit and has its core in a completely different view of Judaism. While with Hegel, since his Phenomenology of Spirit in 1807, the spirit rises in dialectical steps from simple perception through the reflection of history and revelation and self-reflection of consciousness to the self-consciousness of freedom, absolute knowledge, and the world spirit coming to itself, Krochmal sees only God as an absolute spirit, Ruach HaMuchlat, an absolute spirit which has been recognized by the Jews since ancient times. The other peoples and their respective national spirit, the Volksgeist, here Krochmal uses a term from Herder, on the other hand only develop particular ideas of God and gods. Only the Jews share in the absolute spirit of Jewish monotheism. Only through Jewish history and in Jewish history does the absolute spirit of God act on the Jewish people, reveal itself and manifest itself in Jewish religious history, which is told chronologically in numerous chapters of Krochmal's Morende Vuchei Hazman. In contrast to Hegel's philosophy of religion, in Krochmal's Jewish religious history of the absolute spirit, Christianity never replaces Judaism. Rather, Judaism as a religion of the absolute spirit will never be overtaken or superseded by any religious historical progress in world history until the present day. As a rabbi, Samuel Hirsch was one of the leading representatives of Reform Judaism in Germany, Luxembourg, and the US. His early work on religious philosophy, Die Religionsphilosophie der Juden, the religious philosophy of the Jews, from 1842, directly confronts Hegel's philosophy of religion. Hirsch is not a skeptic of progress, but for him, only Judaism makes religious progress beyond paganism and Christianity. Hirsch tells world history as a religious history initiated by God, in which Judaism as, quote, active religiosity and as intensive religiosity overcomes paganism, Christianity as extensive religiosity arises from Judaism and spreads throughout the world, while ultimately a messianic absolute religiosity unites Christianity and Judaism in the future. For Hirsch, Reform Judaism is the legacy of biblical and rabbinic traditions as well as of Christian impulses. On this point, Samuel Hirsch represents a whole generation of liberal rabbis and Jewish religious philosophers who take Christianity seriously as the offspring of Judaism, but reject Christian theology of history and philosophy of history, in which Christianity replaces Judaism in world history and replaces it as an historical power. This so-called substitution theology in Christianity, which survived only slightly secularized in the historical philosophy of Lessing and Hegel, is countered by the Jewish liberal rabbis and religious philosophers with an upgrading of messianism in a specifically Jewish philosophy of history, as was recently documented by George Kohler in his work Der jüdische Messianismus. Messianism, among these liberal rabbis, reform rabbis, messianism is no longer the coming of one personal Messiah, but the universal spread of Jewish biblical ethics and the Ten Commandments in the world, to which Christianity also has historically contributed. Christianity thus serves the universalization of Jewish ethics. So it's an inversion of the progress. Before the First World War, the philosopher Franz Rosenzweig had already critically examined Hegel's political and legal philosophy in his dissertation Hegel und der Staat, Hegel and the State. In the third part of his major work on religious philosophy, The Star of Redemption, published in 1921, he deals with the relationship between Judaism and Christianity. Contrary to Hegel, he redefines the role of Judaism in this relationship. Like Samuel Hirsch and Rosenzweig's elderly mentor Hermann Cohen, he takes Christianity very seriously, but he avoids the Jewish messianic outdoing of the Christian philosophy of history as he knows it from Hirsch and Cohen. In The Star of Redemption, Rosenzweig declares Jews to be the eternal people, which has an immediate relationship beyond time with God as the eternal Father. The Jews are always already, beyond time and history, chosen to be the eternal people of the eternal God. The Christian peoples, however, and on the other hand, live in time and history. As with Hegel, they develop and realize their relationship to God in historical time and in world history. In this way, Rosenzweig dehistoricizes and existentializes being a Jew. Judaism is the religion of the non-historical eternal people in relation to the eternal God, while Christianity and Christians advance and realize world history in time. The Jew's relationship with God is thereby completely detached and made independent of the historical progress or historical decline of world history, of war and inflation, of crime and historical ruptures, of state history, industrialization and economics. Jews are religiously and existentially disconnected from world history in their relationship to the eternal God. In the religious relationship with God, there is no progress, only eternal presence. This religio-philosophical vault against Hegel and the philosophy of history, namely Judaism outside of history, also explains Rosenzweig's unmistakable distance from Zionism. And it explains why Gershom Scholem can claim, in the spirit of Rosenzweig, that the Jewish people only re-entered world history with Zionism and the founding of the State of Israel, and therefore would henceforth make history themselves again. Karl Löwith, once Heidegger's first research assistant, then expelled from Germany and Italy as a Jew, wrote a work on the history of philosophy in North American exile that made him famous. Meaning in History. It's a book considered the canonical overview of the history of Christian theology of history and of Christian philosophy of history, from Augustine to Joachim of Fiore, Kant, Lessing, Hegel to Marx and Kant. Löwith interprets the modern philosophy of history since Voltaire and its thinking about progress as he interpreted this Christian philosophy of history as a secularized Christian theology of history. At the same time, he declares this secularization to be a philosophical failure and the philosopher's optimism for progress to be ideological and implausible. The undeniable technical and scientific advances of modern times have not led to improved social coexistence among humanity. Löwith therefore advocates a, quote, dismantling of the Christian theological tradition in philosophy and votes with Nietzsche for a move away from the linear, progressive Christian model of history to a much more modest, circular model of history as existed in ancient Greece and which is taken up by Nietzsche's idea of an eternal return of the same. In this later model of history, which is based on natural cycles such as the four seasons, there are no irreversible epochal advances in morality, culture, politics, or civilization. Löwith casts the Stoic gaze on the confusing history of the 20th century with two world wars, National Socialism and Stalinism, and the Shoah. With Löwith, we close the line of Jewish critics of the Christian philosophy of history and its optimism about progress. Not all of these critics are themselves progress skeptics, but they all share the criticism of historical philosophical supersessionism, where Christianity represents progress compared to Judaism, be it religiously or morally or culturally. Only the Jewish philosopher, doctor, and journalist Theodor Lessing, who was shot in exile in Marienbad in the Czech Republic in 1933 by 3 National Socialist murderers because of his anti-fascist journalism, only Theodor Lessing was even more radical than Löwith in his historical skepticism. In his study Geschichte als Sinngebung des Sinnlosen, History as Making Sense of the Senseless, written during the First World War and only published in 1919 because of military censorship, Lessing not only questions historical progress, what he calls the optimism of history and the hell of progress, rather he fundamentally criticizes historiography and the philosophy of history. The book already contains its thesis in the title. History is the vain attempt to rationally order and causally explain accidental and contingent events, such as wars, catastrophes, epidemics and misery, crimes and death, through historical narration in order to unite the inherently senseless randomness of the events a posteriori and to make sense of it. Through historiography and especially through the philosophy of history, a context of meaning is constructed that, for example, rationalizes the meaninglessness of a dying in war. But this attempt is, according to Theodor Lessing, merely a logificatio post festum, a rationalization. Even the supposed historical progress is just such constructs that are intended to distract from the fact that, as Hegel wrote, world history is a slaughterhouse, but otherwise completely pointless. Schooled on Schopenhauer's Buddhism and Nietzsche's anti-historicism, the history skeptic Theodor Lessing sees history as a lottery of fate, from which every person must find their personal path into life between Epicurean affirmation on one hand and Buddhist denial of the world on the other. For Walter Benjamin, history is apocalyptic. When he wrote his famous Thesen über die Geschichte, thesis about history, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact not only divided Poland. In Benjamin's eyes, it was much worse. The most important revolutionary power in the world, the Soviet Union, had arranged itself with fashion, thus betraying in both theory and praxis the working class and the workers' parties of Europe in their desperate struggle against the fascist menace. For Benjamin, the victims of this struggle were lost in vain, and the hope for redemption through the dictatorship of the proletariat after the October Revolution was shattered. Gog and Magog had allied themselves at the expense of the oppressed. Under these circumstances, Benjamin pessimistically interprets all of world history, past and present, as a history of disaster, filled with oppression, exploitation, and destruction. The future, in contrast, is for the Jews, as Benjamin writes, not an empty and homogeneous time, for in the future, every second will provide a small gate through which the Messiah may pass. Nonetheless, for Benjamin, the coming of the Messiah does not entail a promise for a better future, but instead a stabbage of the continuum of the history of disaster on earth, in that it disrupts the homogeneity of time and ends the disastrous course of history. Where progress of human history in homogeneous times can be conceived only as a storm that blows the angel of history, we see the Paul Klee drawing. We see the if history can only be conceived as a storm that blows the angel of history and all other observers of the ruins of history in the past further and further away from paradise, only the Messiah and the last judgment can bring it all to the end. That everything just goes on, Benjamin writes, is the very catastrophe. The supposed progress in history, the continuing exploitation of nature and man, found in socialism as well, makes the heap of ruin and the core of corpses only larger. The symbol of the Messiah signifies that it could still be possible to stop the progress of this history of disaster. Still, the human race can neither bring about the end of history by its own power, nor influence the coming of the Messiah. For Benjamin, only the possibility of ending history, symbolized by Messiah, exists, instead of carrying on with the empty hope of successive future amelioration of an endless time axis. Liberal faith in progress, social democratic reformism, and communistic belief in the necessary victory of the proletariat at the end of all class struggles are all illusions. Benjamin's outline of a theological materialistic historiography can trace messianic sparks in the past, redemptive moments of instant happiness, Jetztzeit, in an endless history of disaster, in that it brushes history against the grain. Nevertheless, Benjamin offers neither plan nor perspective nor agency for contemporary or even future times in political action. He is deeply pessimistic concerning the future of the world. Here you see typical German professors. You know, I'm not a typical German professor. Dialectic of Enlightenment, one of the canonical philosophical texts of this 20th century, will only be touched upon here. Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno wrote it in exile in California and published it as a book in Amsterdam in 1947. Contrary to a widespread understanding of enlightenment, which sees enlightenment as a progress in the rationality and reasonable self-determination of man, and his progressive liberation from the tutelage of natural forces, religion, and political authority, the dialectic of enlightenment states that in modernity, since the Enlightenment, reason was narrowed down to instrumental reason, which dominates alienates and exploits the external and the internal nature of man, and is ultimately functionalized into the domination of people and over nature. The progress in the rational control of the world through science and technology leads to a progressive exploitation of people and nature under capitalism through instrumental reason. The supposed progress of enlightened rationality is becoming, by the use of instrumental reason, so destructive that there is no room for historical optimism and change. Horkheimer and Adorno appear particularly skeptical of progress and openly attached to Kulturpessimismus, to cultural pessimism, in the famous chapter on the Kulturindustrie, which emerged from their Californian experiences with US media and cultural productions. If authentic art and culture are originally an end in itself, it becomes a commodity in the culture industry, which is supposed to be made marketable and sellable through endless reproduction of the same cultural product and serving the same emotions of the majority. The paradigm here is the Hollywood film, whose commercial success is based on meeting and reproducing mass taste instead of artistic quality. Commercial quantity reigns oppressively over artistic quality, when authentic artistic creativity is completely subordinated to market power by the film studios. The result is not artistic progress and innovative avant-garde art, but rather cultural regression and mass stupidity among the audience, not only in the film industry, but also in the modern music industry, which is gradually replacing the classic theater and concert business. Günther Anders received his doctorate from Edmund Husserl in Freiburg in 1924, and he attempted a phenomenology of modern technology in his main work, Die Antiquiertheit des Menschen, the obsolescence of man. The work was published in 1956, and it is based on Anders' difficult exile experiences in France and in the US after 1933, where in the exile he had to work in a variety of odd jobs and got to know the modern working world from below. Anders states that the obsolescence of man is caused by the dehumanization of man through modern technology. Humans are antiquated because advances in modern technology create machines and weapons whose perfection is superior to the always imperfect humans and tends to even make them superfluous. Technological progress creates a Promethean gap between the perfection of technology and the imperfection of man, which creates feelings of inferiority and shame in man, because man is not equal to the technology he has invented. Man adapts to technology and not the opposite. People serve technology, not technology serves people. Technology dominates and destroys human coexistence instead of promoting it. This deforms humanity. For Günther Anders, the outstanding example of the fact that modern technology has escaped from humans and dominates them is the atomic bomb. Once invented, it cannot be abolished. The dropping of the first atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki is a unique event in world history. Since then, humanity has known that with the help of modern technology, it can now completely destroy the planet and itself. Progress and omnipotence of technology become destructive here. Technical progress threatens to destroy not only humanism, but also humankind itself. That is why Anders was politically and journalistically involved in the anti-nuclear movement and later in the ecology movement until his death in 1992. The ecological catastrophe also reflects the destructiveness of modern technology and industrialization. Our current discussions about artificial intelligence and the question of its controllability by humans could easily be reflected in Günther Anders' thesis on the Promethean gap. Humans create technical innovations such as artificial intelligence, which in the end they no longer control and even cannot estimate the consequences of the use of artificial intelligence. The same applies to the discussion about the possibilities and limits of genetic manipulation. It is always about a skeptical reflection on the controllability of technical progress, through which, as Anders put it already in 1956, people can do more than they can imagine. The consequence of Anders' critique of technological progress is humans should not do or may not do everything that they can do due to technological progress. But that is an entirely new reflection. In that same book, Die Antiquiertheit des Menschen, Günther Anders also offers a phenomenology of television as a technical medium which is similar in its cultural pessimism to Adorno's criticism of the culture industry, and which could easily be transferred to the world of computer games. The screen becomes a substitute for the world, the technical simulation of the world instead of authentic human coexistence in the real world outside, isolates and deforms people's humanity. With this, Günther Anders and Horkheimer Adorno explicitly agree on another point. The industrialized mass murder in Auschwitz would not have been possible without instrumental reason and modern technology. And this they write explicitly. The central argument and common thread of Leo Strauss's seminal book, Natural Right and History, published in 1953, is that natural law and the innate rights of people cannot be overtaken and relativized by any historical or political process in the present or in the future, but rather are disregarded and distorted at best in many modern states and dictatorships. Particularly, the first chapter of the book, entitled Natural Right and the Historical Approach, is directed against the lure of political moral optimism about progress in political philosophy and in legal positivism. Here, Strauss explicitly mentions the constitutional law theorist Hans Kelsen and his law positivism. Strauss insists on the everlasting validity and historical insurmountability of natural law against the law positivism of the Kelsen school, which actually denied the existence of natural law. Against Kelsen and his school's idea of casting social progress into corresponding laws through a majority vote in a legalistic and positivistic manner, which is still widespread today, especially among social democrats, Strauss argues that a simple positivistic majority vote could also reverse such legal progress and law procedures. If not, constitutional law based on natural law and natural rights of the citizens protects the legislation and law procedures. Sheerly positivistic majority rule may discriminate minorities and ignore their rights. Hitler was elected by a majority vote and then abolished democracy and basic rights with the legitimation of majority vote. This is not my example, this is Strauss's example. By majority vote, without the protection of a constitution based on natural law, democracy can abolish itself. In principle, for Strauss, as long as people are born on earth, they have innate, inalienable natural rights, regardless of any historical change, progress or regression in politics, states, religion, society, culture or morality. Whatever the changes of the Weltgeist, and he refers also to Hegel, whatever the changes of the Weltgeist, natural law is firm and forever. This is the basis of all international human rights declarations and of international law conventions. And here, Leo Strauss completely agrees with our starting point, namely with Moses Mendelssohn. There are innate human rights whose normative validity can never be changed by any historical change, revolution, progress, or regression. To sum up, no, doesn't work anymore. Yep. This lecture presented several different forms, and very different forms, of skepticism about progress among modern Jewish philosophers. First, Mendelssohn's criticism of the idea of humanity's progress in morality, that is, a criticism of moral progress. Second, the anti-Hegelian criticism of religious progress and supersessionist Christian theology of history, where Judaism is replaced and overcome by Christianity, an idea that can be found in Christian theology of history and only slightly secularized in the philosophy of history. This criticism is expressed in different ways by Heine, Nachman Krochmal, Samuel Hirsch, Franz Rosenzweig, and Karl Löwith. Third, a general criticism of historical thinking and the belief in progress as a rationalization of the senseless and the accidental by Theodor Lessing. Fourth, a criticism of the political belief in progress and the materialistic historical determinism among social democrats and communists, written by Walter Benjamin. Furthermore, 5, a criticism of the assumption of intellectual and cultural progress since the Enlightenment and through the Enlightenment in Horkheimer and Adorno. 6, Günther Anders' criticism of the destructiveness and dehumanization caused by technological progress. And 7, Leo Strauss's criticism of the belief in the progressive historical evolution of laws and legislation. So I have 7 different types of progress skepticism. Last but not least, we must also ask the critical methodological question of what is specifically Jewish about the skepticism or the criticism of progress of these Jewish philosophers and intellectuals. Couldn't this criticism have come from Christian, Muslim, or atheist philosophers? Of course, we would have to discuss this in each individual case, but I don't want to avoid a thesis here. Yes, there is a specifically Jewish perspective in this skepticism and criticism of progress by Jewish thinkers. This can be clearly shown for the 18th and 19th century. They argue against the anti-Judaic, that is, anti-Judaism tendency and terminology of Christian theology of history, a theology of substitution, and the Christian-influenced philosophy of history. As Jews, they insist that Judaism is not an outdated religion that has been historically overcome by progress. This criticism begins with Mendelssohn and ends with Rosenzweig and Löwith. The answer to the methodological question is more difficult with Theodor Lessing, with Walter Benjamin, with Horkheimer and Adorno, and with Günther Anders. What is specifically Jewish there? Here, I would like to answer what is specifically Jewish for all of these thinkers is their experience of anti-Semitism and mass death in the First World War. What is specifically Jewish is the experience of legal expatriation in Germany, of expulsion, flight from the Nazis, and exile. Finally, it is the experience of the Shoah, which for such diverse Jewish thinkers as Horkheimer, Adorno, Anders, and Strauss was explicitly an existential stimulus for their criticism of progress. The Shoah is an event that made not only Jewish thinkers, but especially Jewish thinkers, doubt and despair of all advances in morality, culture, humanity, and even technology. Thank you for your attention.